Powerful insights often occur when you least expect them. On transformative leadership conversations, they're at the heart of every episode. Hi, I'm your host, Winnie da Silva. In this season, I'm sharing short, focused, and practical leadership ideas and insights, myths worth challenging, and tools you can immediately apply to strengthen your leadership and build more effective teams. So today's episode is a little bit different from previous episodes this season. So over the last several episodes, I've introduced 3 specific frameworks that I use regularly in my work with clients, including these 3: story, behavior, result, adaptive leadership, and trust. In those 3 episodes, we focus primarily on the concepts themselves and how those frameworks can help leaders think differently about their leadership, their teams, and the challenges they're facing. Now, of course, frameworks and thinking alone don't enable transformation, right? Transformation happens when these ideas are applied inside real situations with real people over time. It happens through reflection, experimentation, difficult conversations, new awarenesses, and behavior change. So in today's episodes, I'm going to pull back the curtain a little bit and walk you through 3 client examples that bring these 3 concepts and frameworks to life. So each story comes from one of the 3 core areas of my work: executive coaching, leadership development, and team effectiveness. While these are distinct work streams, what I love about doing all 3 is that they constantly reinforce each other. Similar themes tend to emerge again and again across individuals, teams, and organizations. So if you haven't yet listened to the previous episodes on story, behavior, and result, adaptive leadership, and trust, I encourage you to take a listen. However, this episode will stand on its own as well. But as these ideas resonate with you, take a listen to those previous episodes to give you a deeper dive into those frameworks. The first story I want to share comes from executive coaching work and connects directly to the story, behavior, result framework. In the episode where I introduced that framework, I talked about the premise behind this leadership tool, which is this: the stories we tell ourselves shape how we behave and the results we get. If we want better results, we have to examine the stories and assumptions driving our behavior. Essentially, we have to think about how we're thinking. And when I use the word stories, what I'm really talking about here are the stories we kind of have running through our heads. Those internal narratives, beliefs, and assumptions, the things we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. Now, most of these times, these stories, they're not even conscious, but they directly impact how we lead, how we respond to challenges, how we engage with other people, and ultimately, the results we produce. And this is one of the reasons story, behavior, and result becomes such a powerful tool in executive coaching work, because often the visible leadership challenge is being driven by deeper stories and assumptions the leader hasn't fully uncovered or examined. So a few years ago, I was coaching a leader, I'll call him Mark, who had just been promoted into his first people management role. Now, Mark inherited a team he hadn't built himself. The team had been assembled from various parts of the organization, and several of the individuals, they also hadn't chosen to be on that team in the first place. And as a result, some were disengaged, some lacked accountability, and a few came with some clear performance issues. So this was not an ideal leadership transition for Mark. But to his credit, he was working incredibly hard. He was investing time getting to know the people on his team, trying to understand their goals and motivations, working to establish expectations, and genuinely doing all he could to get comfortable in this new role and lead this team to the best of his ability. But despite all of that effort, neither the individuals nor the team was really improving. He was constantly frustrated and exhausted and feeling like he was pushing uphill all the time. So as we worked together, one thing slowly became clear. Beneath all of his behavior was a story he was telling himself that he barely even realized was there. In fact, he outright told me this story one day in a coaching session. He said this to me: "I'm not a good people manager. I'm better as an individual contributor." And that story was reinforcing a mindset of being stuck in circumstances where he really felt like he was out of control. Issues on the team became evidence to him that he was failing as a leader. If someone underperformed, he ended up internalizing it. If expectations weren't met, he absorbed the responsibility for it. If someone disengaged, he viewed it as proof that he lacked leadership capability. Now, to be clear, there were things Mark certainly needed to learn and improve on, but the story itself prevented him from seeing the full picture clearly. It kept him from recognizing that some of the challenges were not solely about his leadership ability. Some of the issues were structural. Some were about the composition of the team, a team he had inherited and not hired to his own specifications. And some of the issues were performance problems that required accountability and really difficult conversations and difficult decisions, not just more effort from him. The uncovering of Mark's story became a really important turning point in our work together, because once we identified the story, we could start examining how that story was driving his behavior and ultimately the results he was getting. So instead of, I'm not a good people manager, the story shifted to, I have the potential to become a strong people leader, and this particular situation requires me to lead differently and make some difficult decisions. That shift changed his behavior in some very meaningful ways. He stopped over-functioning for the team. He became clearer and more consistent about what his expectations were. He addressed performance issues more directly. But this one is even more important. He began separating what belonged to him as the leader from what belonged to the individuals on the team. He also very importantly, began advocating upwardly more effectively with his own manager about the structural realities and challenges with the team and what he wanted to do about it. And over time, things did start to improve. Not overnight. There was real work to be done, and it was iterative. It involved reflection, experimentation, some setbacks and adjustments, and repeated conversations. But the shift was significant because Mark stopped taking the wrong kind of ownership. As leaders, we don't want to be focused on fixing the visible result or problem that we don't stop to examine the underlying stories and assumptions which directly impact our behavior and the outcomes we want to achieve. The second client example comes from the leadership development and training I do with my clients, which connects directly to the adaptive leadership framework I introduced in a previous episode. At its core, adaptive leadership is about choosing the right leadership approach for the right people in the right circumstances. Now, to be an adaptive leader, you need to build awareness around yourself, the person you're leading, and the situation you're in. One of the key ideas within this framework is that most leaders have a leadership style preference along the continuum of directing, collaborating, and delegating. Now, those preferences are not inherently good or bad in and of themselves, and they often, each one of them, come with some real strengths. But leadership challenges can emerge when we overuse our preferred style instead of adapting intentionally based on what the person and the situation actually require. While this next example emerged from an executive coaching client, I use this story all the time when facilitating adaptive leadership programs because it so clearly illustrates one of the central ideas within the framework. So several years ago, I was working with an executive, I'll call him David, after conducting a Leadership 360 assessment as part of our executive coaching engagement. A primary theme in the feedback from his direct reports was that they felt micromanaged. They described him as too involved, overly directive, and not giving people enough autonomy. Yet, David really did genuinely care about developing his team. He was highly invested in helping people succeed. So when we started unpacking that feedback together, we realized that there was something deeper driving his leadership approach. So it was interesting because as he reflected, he realized that earlier in his career, David had worked for a leader who delegated almost everything to him immediately, right? As a person in the company and as a new leader. So in theory, maybe that sounds empowering, right? But in practice, David felt unsupported and, quite frankly, completely overwhelmed. He didn't know what good looked like. He didn't receive enough guidance. And David ended up spending a lot of time trying to figure things out on his own, essentially spinning his wheels. And as a result, when David became a leader himself, he developed a very strong preference for a much more directing leadership style right from the start of working with a new direct report, because he believed good leadership meant providing people with clarity, structure, support, and hands-on guidance right up front. His instinct was to help people learn by closely being involved early on, but then to gradually lead them using collaboration delegation over time. And in many ways, there are real strengths to that approach. So the issue wasn't that his preferred leadership style was directing. The issue was that David was defaulting to that style way too broadly across different people and situations without fully realizing it or communicating why he was choosing that particular leadership style. This is exactly what adaptive leadership is all about. One of the core ideas within the framework is that all of us tend to have a leadership style preference along that continuum: directing, collaborating, and delegating. All of these different leadership styles, they're good, but problems emerge when we only use our preferred style without thinking, instead of intentionally adapting our leadership approach, again, based on the person, the situation in front of us. So David's directing approach worked very well in some contexts. It created clarity. It reduced ambiguity. It helped newer team members understand what his expectations were very clearly. But for more experienced team members who wanted greater autonomy, it started to feel restrictive and frustrating. Another really important insight was this: David's team didn't actually understand what he was trying to do developmentally. They simply experienced the behavior itself. So once we unpacked all of this together, David started becoming much more intentional about where and when he used each leadership style. He began asking himself questions like this: does this person need more direction right now? Would collaboration create a better outcome here? Is this situation where delegation is the best approach? But I think this might have been the most important change. David started communicating his leadership intent much more explicitly with his team. People didn't need to interpret his behavior. For example, David was transparent about why he would use a directing leadership style and how it would benefit them, the situation, and even himself. In fact, he even shared his story about why he chose directing as his default leadership style. So over time, David's dynamic with his direct reports started to shift. His team experienced more flexibility from him, and David became much more aware of both the strengths and the drawbacks of his preferred leadership style and the others. And he started to more intentionally use those other leadership styles when it was appropriate. The last client story moves beyond individual leaders and into the work I do with teams. In a previous episode, I introduced the trust framework, which explores 4 key dimensions of trust: knowing the person, competence, sincerity, and reliability. One of the core ideas within that framework is that trust is not accidental. It can be built intentionally through deeper understanding, consistent behavior, and deliberate investment in relationships over time. And while this next story includes some of those concepts embedded within the experience itself, what I think it really demonstrates is how quickly trust can accelerate when people move beyond surface-level assumptions and begin to understand each other much more deeply as human beings. So I had a client I worked with for many years at a few different companies, and she reached out to me after receiving a major promotion. So I'll call her Annie. She had recently become the head of North America for her organization and inherited a very large executive leadership team during a period of significant organizational change and integration, with big financial expectations as the portfolio company of a large private equity firm. There had been multiple mergers and acquisitions prior to her stepping into this role. So many people on the executive team came from different legacy organizations and therefore different cultures. The team was also geographically dispersed, highly virtual, and had never really functioned together as one cohesive executive team before. So Annie called me because she was trying to accomplish several things simultaneously. She needed the team aligned around business goals and strategic priorities. She needed stronger collaboration across the entire organization. And she also knew that trust was a brewing issue beneath many of the team's challenges. What quickly became clear were the deeper dynamics beneath the surface. There were silos, historical baggage, tensions between different groups, culture clashes, different assumptions about roles and responsibilities. Some voices were dominating, while others held back. Certain relationships had become strained. And because some of these leaders knew each other really well and some didn't know each other well at all, people were also interpreting behavior without much context. So, because of the complexity and the urgency to create an effective team, Annie decided to engage me to work with her team following my team development methodology. After meeting with the entire team, they agreed, and we started with a team assessment. So, one quick side note, if you want to learn more about my broader team effectiveness methodology and framework, check out season 4 of this podcast, where my colleague Peter Axelson and I walk through the full team development framework and the building blocks of effective teams in much greater depth. So, back to that team assessment. So I ended up interviewing every member of the executive team individually for about 90 minutes each. We explored the state of the team, the business challenges, their relationships with one another, perceptions of team effectiveness, and also feedback for Annie herself as the leader of the team. So one thing I always pay close attention to in team development work is the quality of the interpersonal relationships across the team. Because when relationships break down or trust weakens, the impact spreads far beyond the individuals involved. It affects things like collaboration, decision-making, communication, accountability, and ultimately business results. After gathering all of that data, I pulled together a detailed synthesis of the findings along with a draft team development plan. So before the larger team offsite occurred, I first walked Annie through all of the feedback, including the feedback about her own leadership. When we came together with the full team for the offsite, we spent several hours walking through the assessment findings as a team. We unpacked all the patterns, the tensions, frustrations, also the strengths, different perceptions. We talked honestly about what was helping the team and what was undermining their effectiveness. We also reviewed the feedback the team provided to Annie. So I want to note that this is always a very critical aspect of the work. When the senior leader, the team leader, in fact, is willing to receive difficult feedback openly and allow that feedback to be discussed transparently with the whole team, it immediately changes the dynamics in the room and on the team because it signals openness, vulnerability, and a willingness to participate in the work personally, not just direct it from a distance. After this intense debrief discussion of the data, we took a break and moved into the trust work, which is a perfect segue from that kind of debrief of the assessment. We explored the trust framework together, knowing the person, competence, sincerity, and reliability, and discussed how each person thought about trust, what mattered most to them in building it. Then we moved into a much deeper exercise where team members reflected on a series of personal questions about their background, their experiences, challenges, what motivates them, their relationship with conflict, and how they preferred to work and how they preferred to receive feedback. Now, what's always fascinating in these moments is how quickly assumptions begin to shift once people have more context about each other. So there was one particular moment that really stayed with me. So there was a leader on the team, he was the CTO, who many people found difficult to work with. They really respected his expertise, his intelligence, and his work ethic, but they experienced him as demanding, rigid, and very hard on people when expectations were not met. So as he started to share more about how he grew up, his family dynamics, the expectations placed on him throughout his life, and the environment that shaped him, you could literally feel the room changing. After he spoke, and based on comments and questions from his colleagues, I could tell that people's perceptions of him were already starting to shift. They were beginning to understand him with much more of that context, more empathy, and more humanity. And that changed how people engaged with him after the offsite. There were several moments like this throughout the session. People discovered unexpected common ground through those conversations. Some realized that they had made assumptions about colleagues that they barely knew. Others recognized that certain tensions had less to do with the personality and more to do with stress or history or differing expectations or experiences. So what this team was looking for was not surface level team building. That's not what we were doing. What they realized is that they needed deeper and more intentional opportunities to make implicit assumptions explicit, to understand each other more deeply, and to build trust and rebuild trust in some cases in a direct and very deliberate way. So I feel like today, especially in our work environment where teams are virtual, we're geographically dispersed, things are fast moving, and we're often assembled through growth and acquisition, this kind of intentional trust building is critical now more than ever. So as I reflect on these 3 client examples together, what strikes me is that while the situations were very different, the underlying dynamics were surprisingly similar. In each case, people were reacting to what was visible on the surface without fully understanding what was driving the behavior underneath. Performance challenges were connected to stories and assumptions. Frustrations were shaped by leadership preferences and default patterns. And trust breakdowns were sometimes fueled by misleading context, historical baggage, and unresolved tensions. And in all 3 examples, meaningful change only started to happen once they slowed down together, became more curious, and worked collaboratively to build deeper awareness around themselves, other people, and the situation in front of them. Because ultimately, this kind of transformational work is not something I do to clients, right? It's something we co-create together through reflection, experimentation, really honest conversations, and intentional behavior change over time. And honestly, this is one of the reasons I love the work that I do. People often ask me which area I enjoy most: executive coaching, leadership development, team effectiveness. But the truth is this: I really love all 3 because they reinforce each other constantly. And when this work is integrated thoughtfully across individuals, leaders, and teams in partnership with clients over time, it can have an exponential impact toward creating incredibly powerful, lasting leadership and organizational transformation. So, as you reflect on your own leadership, your own team, or your own organization, I'd encourage you to pause and get curious about a few things. What challenges or frustrations keep surfacing over and over again for you? What visible problems might actually be symptoms of something deeper underneath? What stories, assumptions, habits, or default patterns could be shaping the way you or others are behaving and ultimately influencing the results that you're getting? And where might you need to adapt your leadership approach or style more thoughtfully and intentionally for the specific people and situations in front of you, instead of relying too heavily on your own preferred leadership style? And lastly, where might trust need to be a more intentional investment and attention? Where are assumptions, lack of context, or unresolved tensions getting in the way of stronger collaboration and better business results? Because transformation of any kind is rarely one insight, one coaching session, one workshop, or one conversation. It's a process of awareness, experimentation, reflection, adjustment, and continued growth over time. And importantly, it happens through relationships, through honest conversations, thoughtful challenge, feedback, partnership, accountability, learning how to work more intentionally with other people, and that includes ourselves. So whether that's through a coaching relationship with a boss, a colleague, a mentor, a direct report, the broader organization, transformational work does not happen in isolation. Hopefully, this episode gave you a better sense of what this work actually looks like in practice and what it's like to partner with me. If your organization is navigating similar leadership, team, or organizational challenges, I'd love the opportunity to help you uncover what's really driving those issues and work alongside you to create meaningful, lasting transformation. Thank you for listening to this episode of Transformative Leadership Conversations. If you're ready to take your leadership to the next level or empower your teams for success, I'm here to help. Reach out to me directly at winnie@winifred.org or visit my website at www.winniedasilva.com to learn more about my work coaching executives, developing critical leadership skills, and helping organizations build effective teams. You can also find me on Substack, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And remember, you're always welcome to take a seat at the table, where every conversation has the potential for transformative change.